Over the past couple of decades, coastal communities around the world have suffered from rising sea levels and more severe weather. This leads to billions of dollars in damage every year. People are displaced from their homes, some never to return again. The emotional toll is life-changing for residents and business owners who are affected by flooding in coastal areas. In eastern North Carolina, there have been two major storms within the past 5 years. In 2016, Hurricane Matthew hit the North Carolina coast. By the time it was over, there was $1.5 billion in damage and 25 people dead. Just after a large recovery effort, Hurricane Floyd hit in 2018, this time causing $22 billion in damage and leaving 37 dead just in North Carolina. A lot of damage and flooding came from riverine flooding that didn't recede in some areas for weeks. In between major storms like this are more frequent tropical depressions and heavy rainfalls that also bring significant riverine flooding in low areas. This is a never-before-seen problem in our coastal communities because as climate change is taking effect, more development is happening every year. While this development strengthens the state economy, it makes it ever more difficult to reduce flooding and runoff in a cost-effective way. Many in North Carolina are looking towards solutions for these growing problems using nature-based solutions and low-impact development for a comprehensive stormwater strategy. I will be focusing on the North Carolina Coastal Federation's recently released action plan for nature-based stormwater strategies. I chose this action plan because of the number of stakeholders that were involved in the planning. It includes all three sectors of non-government organizations, government, and private business, as well as university researchers. As you can see, the action plan was separated into 4 working groups, with stakeholders contributing to one of their expertise. These working groups focus on new developments, retrofitting of existing land, roadways, and working lands such as farmland and forestry lands. The groups came together with a few cross-cutting impediments and recommendations. For impediments, the first one is a lack of awareness and education by an array of stakeholders, including those who would implement the solutions. Previous planning, regulation, and policy can be inflexible and not allow for stormwater strategies. Difference in projects creates design challenges and leads back to the lack of education. Many engineers who are designing projects don't know how to implement these strategies on different projects that may include varying landscapes or soil types. Many view nature-based strategies as more expensive than traditional strategies when the opposite is often true. There is also not enough government funding for local projects to take off and provide the talent needed for projects. There's an inadequate funding for operation and maintenance as well as for monitoring and evaluating of performance. There are 3 cross-cutting recommendations from all 4 groups. First, state and local governments need to lead by example by providing funding for nature-based projects as well as implementing the strategies in their own projects. Second is to increase the education for stormwater strategies among professionals in all 4 working groups. This includes education in schools and certifications. Lastly is the recommendation for a steering committee that can make sure the action plan doesn't just sit on the shelf. It must be implemented and tracked by an active committee of professionals. To get more insight on this process, I interviewed 3 professionals in this plan. The first was Lauren Kolodij of the North Carolina Coastal Federation. I got her perspective as the deputy director of the federation that conducted this collaboration. She then connected me with 2 professionals in working groups. Amy Wang is an environmental lawyer who contributed to the retrofit working group, and Burrow Smith is a local developer who contributed to the new development working group. These 3 professionals gave more insight than I could have dug up on my own and can explain it better to you than I can. That is why I've recorded their interviews and will now let you hear from them about this wicked problem. First up is Lauren.
I almost feel like we've done this whole project for you, just for you, because there were lots of stakeholders involved. It's a difficult problem to solve. I'd say, well, after Hurricane Florence and Matthew is when the state really first started talking about this, because I-40, which is kind of our main corridor between the coast and the Piedmont and the mountains. So I-40 runs the whole length of our state, and it was closed during Hurricane Florence and Hurricane Matthew, and so much other flooding took place. I mean, it was all over the state, but that was a real blow. That was like one that really just shut down commerce. It shut down everything. You know, people were basically stranded in these bubbles because of flooding. And so then the governor, he did an executive order, Executive Order 80 is what it's called. That called for the state to develop a resiliency plan And so they did that, and that came out last year. And there were a couple of conferences that were held that brought together different stakeholders to try to talk about in a public forum, like what should be included in the state's resiliency plan. And I led one of the panels on stormwater. And it just so happens that the Pew Charitable Trust was at that conference. They actually have a flood communities program, and they approached us, the Coastal Federation, about working together on some sort of project that really would kind of lay out a plan for reducing flooding in the state. What we've determined is that if you mimic the natural hydrology or the land's natural capacity to soak in the rain, what we call nature-based strategies, then you will not only reduce flooding, but you'll protect water quality because you're going to reduce the volume of runoff getting to surface waters. We did these, basically we broke this plan into 4 different groups, so that's focused on new development, roadways, retrofits for, and then working lands. But basically, you know, we brought all those people together. There were over 60 work group members, and they represented all types of different, you know, interests. But the thing is, we wanted people to come to the table agreeing that there's a problem with flooding and water quality, and that have a general understanding and agreement that doing nature-based strategies was at least in part the solution. So we didn't bring together people who would argue with us. So most people kind of already at least had some buy-in to the concept. But I will say, Burke, the thing that's interesting is that we've really gotten buy-in from like DOT. We're not just targeting one type of land use. We're looking at like large scale hydrologic modification that's been done on farm fields, and, you know, doing these types of techniques there. And so it's kind of the first time I've seen this real comprehensive approach to this. And because we have so many stakeholders, you know, the key now is to just keep this momentum going. You know, there hasn't been like this whole paradigm shift. I mean, it's amazing to me how long it takes, you know, for the norm to kind of evolve is taking forever. But I'm really hoping with this new plan, because of all those stakeholders that were involved, there'll be a big push. Developers will listen to developers. Peer-to-peer impact is really important. So having people that are farmers on there, hopefully the farming community would trust them and listen to them. Yeah, and all those, especially like that Amy Wang, you know, she's an attorney with a very, you know, prestigious law firm in North Carolina, and to have so many different experts kind of in their own professional field, but all have had some experiences, to have the different voices speaking for it. If you go to our website, there's under water quality, there's also like a North River Farms, where we've gone in and taken ditched and drained farmlands on like the 6,000 acre farm. And it's holding like a sponge again, the way the land is functioning the way it used to. You know, it's holding back, you know, millions of gallons of rain. It's amazing how well these techniques can work. It will really take implementation. So it's going to take a total commitment. And again, this is going to have to become the norm. I'll give you one more example. Like, I'm doing these projects at UNC Wilmington, and they're all retrofit projects. So it's like fixing an existing problem. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the university is doing new construction, but they're doing it the old conventional way. So it's kind of like sometimes, unless the new construction approach changes, it just counters each other out. I mean, there are engineers that even agree. We've spent 30 years engineering ourselves into this mess of basically, when it rains, the idea is you collect it, you shoot it off into a pipe, and get it off site as quickly as possible. For us to even have, you know, the DOT agreeing that these techniques can and should be utilized. I mean, you know, think of all the right-of-way space along highways and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of capacity in the land that we're just not utilizing because we're collecting and conveying the runoff instead of treating it on site right where it falls. That's the key.
So I practice all across the state, but being primarily located on the coast, there are a lot of stormwater issues and different types of stormwater programs. Some federal, some state, commercial, residential, construction stormwater, post-construction stormwater. And so I do spend a lot of time doing that. When a developer develops a project, the state law requires them to get an approved, they have to submit their plans to a division of the Department of Environmental Quality, and it has to be approved by the Division of Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources, that it's compliant with the stormwater rules and regulations. And then once they build it, they've got to show the agency that the plan that was approved is exactly or substantially similar to what went in the ground, and it's supposed to operate the way it was intended. And then it's supposed to be the permit itself is supposed to be transferred over to the association to then continue operating and maintaining whatever stormwater system's in place. And that's where I get involved, is those rules and regulations and the permit terms. So it started kind of early on, just with conversations and some stakeholder meetings. And then I think the Coastal Federation was able to partner with, I think, Pew Charitable Trust, and got a grant to do a study. I think the Coastal Federation, through its different contacts and relationships, reached out to different professionals across the state who had experiences in different areas. They asked me to be part of the retrofit work study group, because usually where I was interacting with the Coastal Federation was when they were working with community associations who ended up with stormwater management systems they didn't know or understand how to operate, or that weren't compliant with permit. So it's not at the beginning stages when you're designing and putting it in the ground, it's after it's already been in, and then someone figures out that it's either not doing what it was designed to do, or it's not been operated or maintained well enough to do what it was designed to do, and you've got to retrofit it somehow. I understand the legal framework that the design and the permit are meant to mirror to protect water quality. The engineers are the ones on the ground. They understand the design, the capacity, the measurements, how it's actually supposed to work. So they're sort of the technical experts on the actual pieces that function. And then they work with me to figure out, okay, well, here's what the permit says, here's what the law requires, this is what we're going for. Is what is on the ground, is it meeting those things? And if it's not, what are our options?
Now, I was in the new land development one, and because I'm a developer, and to be honest, I used to be a road contractor and utility contractor. I could have probably been in the new road one too, but I think Coastal Federation thought it was important that I can be an example of a nature-based solution, so to speak. I mean, I've been doing this since the 80s, early 80s. When I got out of college, I started developing, and it's not, I keep telling them, it's not new technology. We're actually going back to old technology. And it's simple. You're not creating that much. You're just working with what's already there, and just taking a little bit of time to make that happen. And that's the problem, is most people aren't in tune with that. So I was on that group, and I think I, can bring 40 years of experience, 45 years of experience to the table.
So Eastern North Carolina has a pretty robust coastal area. We have 20 coastal counties that abut the ocean. And the ecosystems, as you come inland, are either rivers or streams or wetlands. So we have a lot of very lush natural resources that are directly impacted by the quality of water. And in addition to that, we have pretty porous soil. It's really sandy. And we have high water tables. So it doesn't take very long for polluted water to get to a groundwater table. And so you have a really pretty dynamic system. The other thing we have in Eastern North Carolina is we have the beach and the water, and it's very attractive to people. People want to live here. They want to move here. They want to retire here even before COVID. And so there's a lot of development that happens here. The pollutant load that ends up in our surface waters that, is a primary driver of our tourism and just our quality of life. And so if we don't figure out ways to manage it, then it's not a sustainable environment for us to maintain long term.
We're getting a lot of buyers in the last 8 months, say, from up north and even from the Piedmont that can work remotely, and they're piling in here. That's why this initiative is important, because if we don't watch out, we're going to screw up why everybody's coming here anyway. So, example I always give on Wrightsville Beach, if you go down by the Blockade Runner and the Holiday, the massive paved areas, they have swimming advisories in the summer when it rains, because there's pollution runs right into the Banks Channel we have. But if you go up to the north end where everything infiltrates, did the parking lots for Cordgrass Bay and Dunes Ridge and all that, you can oyster and clam within 100 yards of the shoreline because everything goes in the ground. I mean, to me, that just says it all right there. And it doesn't matter year round, the water quality up there is always better, because I mean, if you can harbor an oyster and eat it raw, that pretty much means the water is pretty good quality. I think we got a good plan. It was fair. That was one of the reasons I want to get on it too. You just asked me if I've done other type of projects. Nature-based solutions don't fit everywhere, and you can't. And I don't think the plan tries to cram it down anybody's throat and make it law that you have to do it. It's more of a natural progression, and hopefully it'll catch on and more people will do it. But it's, you got to lead by example. And that's one thing too, is we tried to get it to where government agencies would take the lead and show by example that so many times I see it where they preach that you got to do something this way. Then you turn around, you're like, well, your office building isn't doing it, or your site's not doing it. So
Burke and I were talking earlier about the different groups that Coastal Federation put together and what type of professionals made up those groups. And I forgot to mention to Burke that there were state employees that were on these different work groups as well. And I agree with Burroughs. I think the way the study was put together, the meetings and the information sharing, I think resulted in an excellent product, the report. And the process of working with your group and then getting to see what the other groups were doing is sort of an education process in itself with the members in the group. And then having the product now, hopefully it's not going to sit on a shelf and collect dust, that you've got enough professionals in different disciplines that were involved in different pieces of the group that now have more education about the options. They have a design manual for these best management practices. It takes forever to convince them to update them. And hopefully the process of coming up with this strategy will give the regulators some comfort that these strategies work in a lot of different manners and different types of projects. It's not just a one-off unique fit in one area.
I still say the weak link and where you got to get it is the engineers that design these things. The engineers that work for the developers and the engineers or the people who work for state went to the same college. They just, one went private, one went public. And they may not understand or been educated in this low impact and nature-based solutions at all. And so they don't know that much about it. We're trying to get, and I try to emphasize this during all our meetings, is trying to get the state to take the lead and understand and hire some specialists that understand. They can meet with people early on and it's education.
I think Burroughs made a really good point, and that is, as getting these concepts into students and the younger generations that are going to come into the industries, whether they come in as a traffic engineer or a developer or a zoning officer, getting the information in front of the younger professionals so it just becomes part of your language gives us more optimism about these strategies being implemented.